Welcome back to the Conservative Commandos. We're glad you've stuck around. We're to the point of the show where we have our guests on. And fortunately, we always have the very best guests. We really do have just stellar guests, people who really know what's going on. Mark Mix is proof of that. He is president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. He also serves as president of the National Right to Work Committee. This is a group that has 2.8 million members. They are worried about worker freedom and having choice in their life. He's been the president of the foundation for quite a while, since 2003. They work, for example, to make sure that there is a free legal assistance available to workers who run into trouble when they butt up against a union that seems unwilling to acknowledge their freedoms and their rights. And so they fight against the abuses of compulsory unionism. So with that, Mark, welcome to the Conservative Commandos. We're glad to have you.
George, great to be on with you, another fighter in the fight for freedom, and I appreciate the work that you do and your organization does.
Well, that's very kind of you. We look in the world today and we see these supply chain issues, and some people think, oh, it's because we're coming out of COVID, it's this, it's that. But the reality is, I think there's a lot of union issues going on here. An example would be, you look in California. It's particularly acute in California. And they have some rules and laws and things in place that have empowered unions and other states that are not quite run the way California is have said, hey, well, then we'll help out. And so they're redirecting traffic and so forth. So this tells me it's not just COVID. There's something more there. Can you help us understand this better?
Yeah, George, of course you're onto something there. There's a lot of basically factors involved in the supply chain trouble that we're up against. And obviously the economy rebounding from what was a shutdown of the American economy a year and a half ago is part of that equation. But look, these problems tend to boil down to two causes. One for sure, and one that comes in as a great second place finisher. First of all is government. Government's intervention in this process and the growing hand and shadow of government on the entire economy is a big problem. And I know that you guys fight against government overreach, although the overreach has gotten so dramatic that we're not sure, exactly what it is. But so government first and foremost, and then secondly, and is important, most importantly about our conversation today, about union monopoly power and how that manifests itself in our port system across the country. And it's making headlines because people are worried about the shelves being filled for Christmas and, worried about getting toilet paper and, paper towels and those types of things. And so let's kind of unpack what the supply chain looks like right now, kind of how America's responding to it, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the issues are as it relates to union power and government power when it comes to the deficiencies in the supply chain. So let's start out this way. United States of America is the number one importer in the world. We're very reliant, unfortunately, on imports from foreign countries, particularly the Pacific Rim and China. And that's not good for the country. I mean, there's certainly problems that are developed, and we could talk a lot about that, but that's a whole different discussion about our dependence on imports. But 40% of all the imports that come into the United States come into two ports, the Long Beach port and the Los Angeles port. Those two ports are the big deep water ports that can bring in these container ships that carry sometimes more than 20,000 containers on one ship. I mean, when you think about that, that's pretty amazing. These are containers that are kind of described as what they call TEU, 20-foot equivalent units. Sometimes they're 40 feet long, sometimes they're 20 feet long. Suffice it to say, that's a lot of containers on one boat. So 40% of all of our imports come through these two ports. And so now let's talk about how governments had an impact on these two ports. First of all, going back to 2018, Assembly Bill 5, which was a bill passed in the California legislature, signed by the governor, basically says that if you're an independent contractor, meaning an owner-operator in the trucking industry, and the trucking industry is a big part of the supply chain and how we take containers off ships, put them on chassis, get them to a warehouse or a railhead or into the economy, frankly, directly into the economy, those chassis and those truck drivers are an important part of the system. Well, this AB 5 legislation said that you could no longer be an owner-operator and work at the ports of Los Angeles. You had to be an employee of a motor carrier. And George, you won't be surprised by this, but hold on anyway. You can't unionize independent contractors, but you sure can unionize employees. And so there's a revenue component to this. And California not being a right-to-work state that protects workers from being forced to pay union dues or fees in order to get or keep a job, you have an immediate source of revenue if everyone becomes an employee and you can unionize those motor carriers. So something like 70,000 independent owner truck drivers have left the state of California because they decided, for whatever reason, they don't want to be employees, or they have other reasons for not being employees. But about 80% of all the work being done at the port is being done by these independent owner operators. So you see the hand of government driving out a major piece of the supply chain component. Then you take the unions, and the unions who are against any kind of automation and any kind of efficiency increases at the ports. In fact, in 2002, there was a strike over the application of barcodes, sensors, and scanners at the port. I mean, nowadays I can call you on my cell phone and see you in person, but yet we can't use barcode scanners and sensors to keep track of containers that are moving around the port. That's because the union monopoly says in order to do any kind of automation, you got to go to us. You got to bargain for that. You got to get in negotiations. So government power and union power, as it basically manifests itself in blocking technological advances, automation, these things that would make the supply chain work better, are two of the components that have been there pre-COVID, before COVID, and have nothing to do with COVID and the economy working its way back. In fact, in 2002, there was a slowdown at the ports over these automation issues. In 1971, there was a 130-day strike on the west coast of these ports over, get this, George, the ability to use containers to ship goods. It used to be this kind of break bulk shipping where everything was in one big haul, and the unions would just go in there and separate all the work. And of course, a TV set would be damaged, or, there'd be a little nick on this, and they'd have to go home. There are all kinds of issues about how you deal with freight and with the containers and the securitization that containers offer shippers. So those two components are probably the biggest components, and we're seeing it manifest itself as we come out of an economic slowdown. Not that we're back where we should be, but we're coming out of it, and so the demand for goods is higher, and that basically exacerbates this problem at the ports.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because when you hear President Biden or other people, they act, everything's transitory, whether it's inflation, whether it's this supply chain problem. It's all just temporary. It's all going to go away. And what you've described is not really a temporary problem. When they've changed the laws in California to essentially kick out 70% of the truckers. And I would think trucking, I used to have a friend who was a trucker, and when I lived in another part of Virginia, and he picked that because it gave him more autonomy. In other words, he owned his own rig, he set up his own stuff, and he was in charge of his own life. He liked that. He didn't want to have to, punch a clock and be there when someone else told him to be there. He enjoyed this autonomy. Evidently, in California, that's not a choice you're allowed to make.
Yeah, that's right. They don't want that because of the unionization issue. And I think it is directly related to the power of union officials to expand their revenue sources by forcing these workers. We originally had the conversation about the independent contractor versus employee. It manifested itself in the Lyft and the Uber drivers. These were people for the same reasons. They picked up a second job. They turned their machines on when they wanted to work. They turned them off when they didn't. They picked up the people they wanted to pick up in the neighborhoods they wanted to pick up in, and they weren't directed by anyone to go there or do this. But yet the unions can't contemplate that because they can't be unionized because they're independent contractors. So it's pretty clear politics plays into this in a big way. And these are kind of legacy infringements on the supply chain. They're not temporary. They're not transitory like everything else. And the Biden administration wants to tell us this. Look, the supply chain problems are a result of you guys being too demanding, that wanting too much, that you should lower your expectations. Those are their words, not mine. That's not America. That's not how we operate. What we operate on are free markets, free economies, and freedom of individuals. And without those, you begin to see yourself being set up for quote, just, grin and bear it and lower your expectations. That's not who we are.
That's a very good point. And one of the things I liked, it was your emphasis there on freedom, because freedom works really well. And nobody has to plan for truck drivers to actually, on their own, buy a rig, invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in this very expensive rig, and then deliver goods. And to do so in such a way that every time I go to the store, the shelves are full and stocked. There's no government agency making all that happen. It's just a bunch of, tens of thousands of truck drivers on their own in the marketplace working. Same thing with, you pick up your phone, you look at your phone. There's no government agency coordinating and making sure your phone is, works or things like that. It's just the marketplace. So I think that your emphasis on freedom is important, because when you look at what America has done, whether it was winning World War II in saving the world from fascism and so forth, from democratic socialism, etc. It did it based on the strength of freedom and the marketplace. And those governments that used command and control systems lost. The Cold War, the command and control systems lost. Their people suffered. They had bread lines. We didn't, etc. So I like the fact that you focus on freedom, because it's not just important kind of in a high school essay on an exam way. It actually impacts life, real everyday life.
Yeah, real life implications. Getting just one more point I wanted to make about the government intrusion on the supply chain, George, is that you talk about truck driver friends. They may have purchased a truck in 2010, a truck that they've used and maintained, and it's working just fine today. But under the California environmental regulation, you can't drive a 2010 or older truck onto the ports anymore because the emissions may not meet the standards that California set. So any owner-operator that has a truck that's dated 2009, you've got this 2009 Kenworth conventional that's been, fabbed out, and you got it beautifully working, you maintained it, you can no longer use that truck in California in the port system because of the so-called environmental issues that are contained in regulatory regime of California. So not only do you drive out truck drivers who are independent, that love their independence, love their freedom, or you drive out those that can't afford the 2020 Kenworth, which costs what? A couple $100,000. Who knows? But getting back to your point about freedom, I mean, the whole country, it's time that we kind of dusted off Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, because he talks about these types of battles and these types of kind of propaganda wars where we redefine what freedom is, or we redefine what liberty is, and we take those words that mean something or meant something, we change their words, and somehow, we convince a whole new generation of people that the idea that collectivism is the foundation stone of forced unionism. I mean, if George, I can tell you what's good for you, whether you want to hear it or not, I will tell you, because you've had some experience in labor law. You know that the primary power that union officials have over an employer is the power they have over their employees. And when you can force those employees to accept collectivism, the idea that, oh, hey, don't worry about it, we're taking care of you, even though in many instances, according to the liberal left and the progressive left, the regressive left, they know that this monopoly power that they have can harm the very workers they claim to represent by taking the best workers down, protecting the worst workers, and making everybody basically, middle of the road and that kind of thing. That's not how economic systems should work, and that's not how freedom should look.
It's a very, very good point. And that's a great place for us to take a quick break. But fortunately, I'm glad you can stick around because there's more to discuss, because freedom matters. And you guys have been real champions of freedom, and I appreciate that. So with that, I'll remind our viewers and our listeners, this is the Conservative Commandos. I'm George Landrith. He's Mark Mix, the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation and the president of the National Right to Work Committee. And we will be right back, so don't go away. Welcome back to the Conservative Commandos. We're glad you stuck around. We've had a great conversation so far with Mark Mix. He is the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation and the president of the National Right to Work Committee. You won't be surprised to find out that they work on things that promote freedom. That's something that matters to me. It matters to Mark, and we're glad we've had a great conversation thus far. I wanted to jump into a little bit of maybe I can raise a couple issues, and maybe I'll raise them all at once, and you can kind of deal with them as you please. But one, there's this huge Build Back Better bill, which I think's a joke. It's a fraudulent name, but there's also people often say things like, "Oh, unions exist so that people get paid better and have, there's someone to protect them from those mean employers." And in my experience, that's often not the case. But I wanted to ask you if that's maybe in my experience isn't accurate there. Maybe it's unrepresentative. But can you maybe go into some of those kinds of questions? Because I feel like if unions did what they're advertised to do, it would be a lot easier to support them. But in my experience, they don't.
Absolutely, George. And let me take the last one first, and then we'll get to the second one, because the second one's a current event. We're dealing with that right now on the so-called Build Back. We call it the Build Back Big Labor Bill, and I'll give you the reasons for that because there's a lot of components in there. But let's start with the idea of unionization and the nature of it in the American marketplace. So Basically, since 1935, the federal government has condoned and supported and protected the idea of collectivism in the labor management relations field. They basically said that this private organization, i.e. a labor union, can force you to associate with them, can force you to participate with them, to force you to accept them as the speaker in the workplace for you, and then ultimately, to add insult to injury, to force you to have to pay them in order to work in the United States of America. When you think about who we are as a country, this grand experiment in individual freedom, individual rights, and self-government, you think about how in the world could a private organization get this much power? Well, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to give political power to his allies, and the union officials were one of the greatest benefactors of that in the 1930s, and to this day still have that power to force you to associate with them as a condition of your working in America. That's outrageous to begin with. And what that created was a problem that Samuel Gompers, the father of the American labor movement, basically laid out in his final speech to the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. They weren't joined with the CIO at that point. But in 1924 in El Paso, Texas, Samuel Gompers, in his final speech as kind of the father of the American labor movement, said this. He said, "The workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions. Anything else is a menace to their rights and will destroy that which brought together through voluntarism is inherently stronger than anything that could be cobbled together through force." And what Gompers understood at the time was he heard the rumors in the grapevine that the delegates of the AFL were going to approach government to have the government grant them this special power to force them onto various industries across the country. And the primary target was the railroad industry. In 1926, Congress passed the Railway Labor Act, which granted union officials the power to speak for every railroad employee in America. And it was federal government power that backed that up. So what they did is they said, we're going to go to government for power. And while it may take longer than most of us like, the idea that you're now basically a ward of government action, that's not going to last. It's not going to help, and it's going to make the institution a lot less receptive to market forces like, hey, do something for me. I'm glad to pay you. I mean, George, you and I joined voluntary organizations because we know what they do, we support their objectives, and by golly, if they do something we don't like, we can simply say, okay, enough, I'm moving on to something else. In labor policy, you can't do that because of this collectivism, this forced association that exists in the law. So when the unions decided to be wards of government, they lost sight of what was happening on the shop floor. So now they're a political operation. They spend literally billions of dollars every 2 years to protect this privilege, whether it be in the state legislature, at the county board, at the school board. I know, George, I think you were on a school board at one time in your life, so you got a chance. In Virginia, it may not have been as difficult as California or New York, but I suspect that the powers, those constituencies that come in and lobby school board members or state legislators or members of Congress are asking for special privileges. And we know when you get special privileges, you try to block out competition, you try to get the sole control of the voice and the framing of issues, and that's what unions have done. And they've lost sight of the workplace. So if workers want to join together to basically get after an employer who treats them badly, the law protects their right to associate. It allows them to unionize, and it happened in 1935, it happens today. And frankly, if an employer doesn't take care of employees, they can expect to have a union come in and say, hey, we can amplify your voice in the workplace. And that's the way the system should work. So right to work is not anti-union, it's anti-forced unionism. And there's nothing good, and I'm a Gompers protege when he comes, there's nothing good that comes from compulsion or force. We know that. Instinctively, we know that. But unions have relied on it. So that's kind of their operating model is, hey, we got to keep political power so we can keep the dues money flowing in as a condition of employment. Fortunately, in 27 states across the country, workers have the choice whether or not to financially support a labor union as a condition of getting or keeping a job. Those are the 27 right-to-work laws that are currently in place across America. Interestingly enough, the AFL-CIO and unions across the country and Joe Biden want to repeal all 27 right-to-work laws across the country. And part of the debate over this so-called Build Back Better, Build Back Big Labor bill is introducing the concepts of expanding dramatically the power of union officials over everything we do. I mean, you won't be surprised, George, that all of the money that will be spent in the so-called Build Back Better or Build Back Big Labor bill basically help union officials. It says, okay, if you're going to do construction, it's got to be Davis-Bacon, union-only kind of wage construction. It's got to have a union element. If you're going to buy an electric vehicle, you got to buy one. You get $4,500 of additional money if it's built by a union operator. I mean, really, really ridiculous kind of special interest stuff that makes no sense in the marketplace, but makes all kinds of sense if you're the recipient of this monopoly power. So lots of issues there, but primarily, as far as workers being able to join together voluntarily to amplify their voice, that right exists. It should exist. We shouldn't fight against that. But employers need to be held accountable for their bad behavior, if indeed there is some in the workplace.
Makes a lot of sense. I was trying to figure out if a country held an election 100 years ago, and then after that election, the president who won the election, his son became the president without an election, and his son became the president without an election, would we still consider it the choice of the people? And I asked that question because I think the answer is kind of obvious. And yet, isn't that how kind of unionization works? And there was 100 years ago, practically, not quite, but getting close now. A place could unionize. I show up today to go work, and it's deemed that I chose to be unionized, even though I may not have. And in some states, they can force me as a condition of accepting the job and keeping the job. I have to join the union. I have to pay them money, even though I never chose to do that, and none of my coworkers did either. Is that true, or am I missing the boat there?
Absolutely right, spot on, George. I mean, I think someone put out a study not too long ago that said less than 10% of all union members in the country today have ever voted on whether or not they wanted to be in the union. To your point, these are legacy contracts. When you think of the General Motors or Ford or Stellantis or whatever, Chrysler, whatever their name is now, I mean, those workers of the United Auto Workers Union had never voted whether or not to be in the union. It just came with the job. And, one of the things that case study of United Auto Workers is a great case study for why we shouldn't have compulsion, why we shouldn't have forced association. Right now, George, you won't be surprised by this, but maybe the listeners will. 12 top executives of the United Auto Workers Union are in jail today because of racketeering, embezzlement, stealing, and living a high life on the backs of rank and file workers because they were never held to account. And it's interesting enough, just last week, UAW members decided that they were going to elect their leadership by one man, one vote now, as opposed to the delegate system that basically fostered that idea that, dad was a union president, son becomes union president, the third becomes union president, and so on and so forth in many of the biggest unions in the country today. These locals, we have this huge story coming out of Philadelphia with Baby Doc, whatever his name is over there, that basically just got convicted of paying off city councilmen and embezzlement and getting special perks from contractors by holding them, saying, look, you're not going to do any more work in this town unless you do it through me. It's just really amazing how that power has manifested itself into corruption and the type of criminal activity that we see in a lot of unions across the country.
Pretty amazing stuff. Mark, you've been doing great work for a long, long time, and National Right to Work has too. So how can our viewers and our listeners follow the work that you all are doing and that you personally are doing? Because I feel like if we had you on the show every single week, it wouldn't be often enough. And so they need to be able to know how to interface with the information and the things that you're working on more frequently than that.
Yeah, George, well, thanks for that opportunity. And thanks for this opportunity to have a dialogue with you. I know you're doing important work for freedom as well. And you've been around a long time as well. I don't mean that either of us are old, but we've been in the movement.
I have the bags to prove it.
Well, I think you took over that group, in 1998, something like that. I'm young compared to you when it comes. I got Reed Larson, the longtime founder and president of the Right to Work movement, granted me the privilege in 2003. So I'm just a pup compared to you. But here's the deal. I mean, if you're interested in what your workplace rights are and the idea of you as an individual in America's workplace, what your rights are, you can find out that information at the foundation's website, the Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. We've been around since 1968. We have 21 staff attorneys that do nothing but help employees whose rights have been violated by forced unionism. We provide free legal services to roughly about 250 cases on any given 12-month period. We have about 250 active cases all the time. And all of these cases are on behalf of individuals whose rights have been violated by forced unionism. And George, unfortunately, it takes courage to stand up to organized labor. It takes courage to stand up in your workplace and say, you know what, this is not right. This is just not good for us. And so when people stand up, they need a place to go to get free legal services and get the best advice they can on their workplace rights. The foundation is the place to find that. And like I said, we've been to the U.S. Supreme Court 18 times on behalf of workers, winning major precedents, improving and growing the rights of workers, and trying to roll back that power that was granted in the 1930s. If legislation's your gig and you want to know about what's happening in your state legislature or in Congress, you can go to the National Right to Work Committee's website at nrtwc.org, and you can find out all the bills that have been introduced in the state legislatures that deal with issues of forced unionism and growing union power. You can find out what our position is. You can get a little rundown on what the bill does, who the sponsors are. You can find a way to contact your state legislators. We also have that same service for Congress. Bills that are basically pending in Congress right now, like the Build Back Big Labor bill. You can find out about that, what's going on with that bill, and you can contact your House member or your Senate member through that website, send them a letter. And so you can also find us on Facebook. I think I have a Facebook page. I promise I don't post anything there, but someone here does. I think we have a Twitter account. However you would tweet Right to Work, I think is how we do that. But our goal is to get information out and help to mobilize people on the forced unionism issue, but also protect workers' rights in America's workplace. We try to do that, and I think we've done a pretty good job, but there's always more work to do, George, as you know.
Yeah, if you're battling for freedom, your work is never done. You can get a lot done, and you guys definitely have. But the reality is tomorrow there's always more to do, because those who want to limit freedom don't seem to ever go to sleep. So we can't either. I appreciate the fact that you guys are never asleep over there at National Right to Work. You're always awake and alert and doing things to protect and promote freedom. Thanks so much for all that you do.
Well, George, thank you. And like I think Ronald Reagan said about your organization, he was a big supporter of your organization in the past, but he said, freedom is one generation away, or I forget how he said it. But the paraphrasing of that is we got to continue to fight. Every morning we need to get up and think about individual freedom, individual liberty, and how to protect it.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much, Mark. Great to have you on the program. To our viewers and listeners, this is the Conservative Commandos. We will be right back, but we have really enjoyed this conversation with Mark Mix, with the National Right to Work. And like I said, don't go away, because there's still more to come on Conservative Commandos.